So I was rewatching the first video I did, and it seemed a little dark in here. So hopefully, I just turned my lamp on. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Um, okay, so in this video, I want to talk a bit about our textbook, which, if you open to the index, you'll see is not organized according to modes of criticism, like many other textbooks in a class like this, but instead the chapter titles refer to things like the beginning, readers and reading, the author, the text and the world, the uncanny. Okay, so these are pretty fundamental ideas when studying literature. It's important to really have a good handle on all of these. But as I say in the very first lecture I ever put up on YouTube for this class, there is a pretty big difference between introducing a list of terms like this to someone studying literature and a list of terms for someone studying, say, cellular biology. Okay. That Bennett and Royal introduce you to these terms not in order to give you a pretty standard definition of each of them, although as we saw for the reading for today, the uncanny is maybe the one that they come closest to giving just a kind of straightforward definition, although they do a great deal of work problematizing that term throughout the chapter too. So I got lost for a second. Point is, they're not presenting these terms to you as if they have a final definition that should be of interest to us, but rather that each of them constitute a problem of their own, and a term that, although pretty familiar to us, although we certainly kind of know what reading is in our daily life, we do it all the time when we look at text message or read websites or check our email, that in literary studies we spend time worrying about what reading is, right? And so that's what they're trying to get you to think about in that chapter. The cool thing about this book is that they get you to think about it in relationship to a work of literature that in some sense is also thinking about it. And so in the chapter Readers and Reading, Bennett and Royal begin by having us read a poem by Shelley, one of the poets in our romantic poetry collection. And in fact, the poem they have us read is in our anthology. They have us read Ozymandias, okay, Ozymandias, which was published in 1818. Okay, and what they do in that chapter is actually pretty remarkable, right? What they do is they walk through a few different ways to read that poem, and they do it in connection with what I've been calling so far different modes of criticism. And so this is the link I want you to make. And sort of write in your notebook and write over and over again, right? That the question, what is problematization? I feel we've already answered that. It's about creating a problem. It's about worrying about a familiar term. It's about lingering with the kind of questions that occur to us when we break open a term, right? That's what it is, but how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we do it? We do it often according to tools that are offered by these various modes of criticism. Okay. The first one we learned about was new criticism, after all. New criticism, if you'll remember from my lecture, is called new because back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it was responding to a way of teaching literature that was really more about appreciation, right? Getting students to simply appreciate your own sense of what a good poem is, and not so much teaching students how to interpret poems on their own. And so new criticism, in order to make interpretation more teachable, they make the decision to bracket out the concerns with the author, concerns with how a poem might make readers feel, and also a concern with up here I'm talking about I'm signaling the world, right? The context in which a poem or a work of literature is written. And so what they want to do is just sort of cut a nice hole out around the work of literature, extract it from those relationships, right? Extract it from those relationships to the author, to the reader, and to the world, and just kind of deal with it on its own terms, if that's even possible, right? And so how does new criticism problematize the meaning of a poem? Okay, how does it problematize meaning? It problematizes it by looking for tensions within a poem, right? Tensions within a poem. Looking for paradoxes, looking for ambiguities, looking for ironies. And so a new critic would try to catalog all the possible tensions, ironies, paradoxes, and ambiguities in a poem, not just for fun, but to, at the end of that cataloging, come up with a kind of unified interpretation that accounts for all of those tensions, that resolves the paradoxes, right? And that gives coherence to a poem that on the surface seems rather volatile and difficult. Okay. And so I might just for fun have us look at a poem. Sorry about that. Have us look at a poem and kind of go from there. So why don't we look at, if you have your books, you can open to, I actually don't know which one I want to do. In class we did the poem "The World Is Too Much With Us," running from 432 to 433, okay? But I want to do a different poem. Let's do Wordsworth's Westminster Bridge, and I'm going to stick with this poem as I move through a few of the modes of criticism that we've read about already. I'm not going to do all of them. I'm just going to do a few of them, okay? Remember, what's useful about a mode of criticism, right, is not that it's better than other modes of criticism, but that it helps us pay attention to features of a poem or the poem's relationship to those things that a new critic is asking us to cut out, okay? And so for right now, we're just going to, for fun, try to occupy that new critical position, okay, as best we can. So this is page 432 of the Romanticism book, okay? Westminster Bridge. Earth hath not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. The city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. Okay, so if we're new critics, what we might do is begin sort of cataloging for ourselves and listing the various tensions within this poem. Now, it's a poem that seems to be resolving tension from the get-go, right? Note, and there's a tension we might note between the first word, earth, right? Earth that we might think stands for, let's say, the natural world, nature, and the thing that is not nature, namely the city that the poet is looking at, right? And so immediately we have a paradox set up in the beginning that the earth has nothing more fair than something that man has made, right? And so the poet is sort of lingering with this idea that at this moment, the city itself appears from the perspective of the Westminster Bridge more beautiful than any natural sight in the world. Okay. And so the poem explicitly then tries to balance those tensions, right? Where the man-made features of the city begin to associate with and tarry with and become intimate with more natural words and descriptions, okay, throughout the whole poem. The city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, right? How does Wordsworth resolve this tension between nature and the man-made structures of a city? By figuring the city as a person, right? It's really in the person that nature and And things that are man-made can maybe come to some sort of unified totality of significance, right? The city now doth like a garment wear, right? And so the city itself takes on a sort of personified quality of needing to wear clothes. And what are the clothes the city puts on? It puts on the clothes of nature, okay? And then at the end of the poem, too, the river that glideth at his own sweet will. And so the river itself is personified as a he, right? Excuse me. And so that's at least the beginning of how a new critic might begin to handle this poem, right? But a new critic might also point out that there is, in making the city a person, that there is something a bit disturbing here, right? About the kind of city that is beautiful. Okay. And I'm thinking, for instance, of sorry again. If you look at line 5, the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Look at line 8, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Why does he describe the air as smokeless? At the bottom of the poem, lines 13 and 14, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. You might notice that although Wordsworth, or the speaker of the poem, is describing a city remarkably dead in terms of in terms of signs of human life, right? The air is smokeless because there are no fires going, right? There's no smoke in the air because there's nobody burning wood in their houses or whatever, whatever they might be burning to produce that smoke, right? The houses themselves seem asleep, and even the institutional structures themselves seem silent and bare. And so there's this odd move the poem makes, to unify the city and nature, to make the city a beautiful aspect of nature, despite the fact that it's man-made. But it only can be as beautiful as nature if we pay no attention to the people who live in it. Right? Now, I'm not going to try to resolve that with the reading I just gave of it, but if I were an eco-critic, let's say, I might try to run with that a bit more, right? I may try to tease out for myself what is really at stake in not just between the city and nature, but between the people who don't seem to be present in the poem at all. The only people present are the figures that are used to personify the city itself. Okay, in some sense, the only real person in the poem is the speaker. Right? And so, if you turn to page, this is this book now. Just looking at the time, I want to make sure I'm not taking up too much time here. If you look at bottom of 15, right, this is not the only mode of criticism other than new criticism that Bennett and Royal deal with in this chapter, but I'm only going to do these two, new criticism and eco-criticism, okay? Bottom of page 15, the recent emergence of eco-criticism has allowed for important new ways of reading such a poem, although they're not talking about Westminster Bridge, but we are, okay? From this perspective, maybe shift back to thinking that they are writing about Ozymandias. From this perspective, Ozymandias is concerned with the relationship between the human, specifically in this case, an ancient human culture, and the environment. Once you think of the poem in this context, its force immediately alters. This is one of the important points I want to draw out, that the modes of criticism that Bennett and Royal are introducing you to, sort of in a barrage in each chapter, each one has a kind of orientation or a kind of aspect or a kind of outlook from which to look at the poem in a different way. There are all ways to sort of turn around a poem and to begin to notice things about it that you might not have noticed if you were inhabiting the position of a new critic, right? If you're inhabiting the position of an eco-critic, sorry, there's noises outside. You already know I get distracted easily. If you inhabit the position of an eco-critic, suddenly a poem may begin to look a little different to you, right? Because, for instance, you may notice that in Westminster Bridge, there's no people, right, other than the speaker. Once you think of the poem in this context, to repeat that sentence at the top of 16, its force immediately alters. It is no longer a poem only about the relationships between people, the pharaoh, the sculptor, the traveler, the speaker and his addressee, the poet, the reader, but also about the effect that a civilization has had on its environment, on what is now the wasted landscape so poignantly described. According to such a reading, Shelley's poem would be understood to respond to the ecological destruction caused by monumental human arrogance. Although there is no sense of desolation quite like that in Westminster Bridge, there is nevertheless a kind of interesting in the fact that the speaker only praises the city as a natural object when there is no signs of people polluting nature. Right, there's no smoke going up into the air. There's no people sort of bustling about in the street. There's no sense in which, right, the silent structures of the city itself are being used in order to be antagonistic toward nature. Human arrogance, period. This desolate landscape in Ozymandias, quote, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away, end quote, can be seen not as natural, but as having been produced by human intervention, perhaps by overcultivation, or through the redirection of water for irrigation, or by other geoengineering endeavors. After all, we can safely assume that Ozymandias' time, the land surrounding the statue, was able to sustain the life that this poem represents only in its absence. An eco-critical reading would pay attention not only to the poem's engagement with political and aesthetic questions then, but also to the wider ramifications of its stark analysis of the eco-destruction that has typified human civilization down the ages. Now, in Ozymandias, that element is maybe a bit more extreme than it is in Westminster Bridge, but I think there is a resonance between the two poems, and that one could bring a kind of eco-critical sensibility to Westminster Bridge in order to tease out the way in which the poem can be shaped and problematized in just such a way where we could really begin to put pressure on and think about terms like ecology, like the relationship between man and nature, like the relationship between city and nature, like the relationship between, right, the environment and the sort of pollutants that go into it, right. Suddenly the poem seems very different than it did when we first approached it in a new critical way. Okay, and in a new critical way. All right. So I hope that helps make sense of what the relationship between problematizing is and the modes of criticism you're learning about, right? The modes of criticism offer tools, concepts, orientations, questions, points of view that enable us to problematize certain ideas in multiple ways, but sometimes in limited ways too. And so in those cases, it helps to move between different modes of criticism or to create a sort of amalgamous blend of modes of criticism, right? So one could blend together a kind of new critical approach to the poem that lists out its tensions, but with an eye toward thinking about issues of ecology. Okay, so one could be a sort of eco-formalist in that sense. And I think it's really those sorts of modes of criticism that are most exciting. And I think that kind of blending and blurring is why Bennett and Royal don't march you through in a linear fashion all those modes of criticism, but sometimes are dealing with multiple modes of criticism in one chapter to get you to see how those different modes interrogate an idea like reading, or interrogate an idea like the author, or interrogate an idea like the uncanny. Okay, all right. So I hope that puts that in a clearer light. And I think in my next video, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the terms that we touched on today and last time. Okay, and maybe also anticipate a little bit some ways to jot down notes in a way that can help you organize all these different kinds of terms a bit more clearly for yourself. Okay.